Sometimes, history doesn't just hide its darkest secrets. It buries them alive, beneath fields of cotton, under the silence of blood-soaked soil, and inside the fragile walls of houses that were never meant to keep their stories quiet forever. Tonight, we open a page from 1847, deep in the red earth of Georgia, where the whispers of a widow echo through a forgotten plantation. Hello, everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Locals called her Anne Marie Colton. To strangers, she was just another grieving widow, left with land, wealth, and a family name to preserve. But behind the polished shutters of her plantation home, there were things even her neighbors feared to imagine. For when her husband's sudden death left her with no heir strong enough to carry the Colton bloodline, Anne Marie made a decision. One that would twist generations. One that would shatter faces into familiar copies of one another. And one that would ensure the Colton name endured, even if it meant breaking nature itself. At first, the truth looked like ordinary Southern grief. A widow in black lace, a house draped in mourning veils. But over time, a pattern began to emerge. Children with eyes too close together. Cousins who shared the same jawline, the same crooked smile, the same uncanny resemblance, as though carved from a single mold. Some said it was fate. Others whispered it was her command. By the time a visitor stumbled onto the Colton land in the late 1860s, the truth was too grotesque to ignore. This was not just a family. This was a forced bloodline, engineered in secrecy, cultivated like a crop she refused to let die. And even as the war raged across the South, even as plantations fell to ruin, the Colton house remained net upright, its curtains drawn against curious eyes, its doors locked tight around its diseased secret. What follows is the unraveling of the Georgia widow's obsession, the forced inbred bloodline she created, the one she fought to hide, and the one the soil itself remembers, long after her name has been erased. Anne Marie Colton was not born into tragedy. She was born into expectation. Her family had owned land in Georgia since before the Revolution, and with that land came reputation. The Coltons were not the wealthiest of the Southern aristocracy, but they prided themselves on lineage, an unbroken chain of blood and name that stretched back to England. By the time Anne Marie was married off at just 17, she knew the unspoken rule. Protect the family. Protect the line. Her husband, Charles Colton, was a rigid man, obsessed with appearances. He gave her a life of velvet parlors, sprawling cotton fields, and Sunday dinners, filled with stern silences. Yet beneath the polished surface, Charles carried a growing fear. He had only fathered sickly children. 2 daughters died before the age of 5. One son was born twisted, unable to walk, and lived only 6 months. Whispers of a cursed womb began to circulate, and the Colton name trembled on the edge of extinction. When Charles died unexpectedly in 1847, some claimed by fever, others by poison that was never spoken of aloud, Anne Marie was left as the sole guardian of a dying dynasty. For most widows, the solution would have been simple: remarry, secure new wealth, start again. But Anne Marie did not remarry. Instead, she locked herself within the walls of the plantation, draped the mirrors in black cloth, and made a decision that unsettled even her closest kin. She would not let outsiders taint the Colton name. No other family would have claim to her land, her legacy, her house. If the line was weak, she would strengthen it herself. If there were no heirs, she would create them, one way or another. And so, under candlelight and shadow, the widow began her grim experiment. She selected cousins, nephews, nieces, blood of her blood, and drew them closer. At first, the gatherings were quiet, hidden behind the lace curtains of the parlor. Then, they grew darker, more frequent, and slowly, children were born. Children who resembled each other so eerily. Neighbors began to speak in hushed tones of something unnatural, brewing behind the plantation gates. The Colton family name would not fade. But its survival came at a price. A price carved into faces that looked too familiar. A price whispered about in church pews. A price that could never be spoken aloud. By the early 1850s, the Colton plantation no longer resembled a house of mourning. It resembled a house of silence. No laughter spilled from its halls. No music carried into the fields. Only the cries of newborns, the sound of shutters drawn shut, and the low muttering of servants who dared not speak too loudly of what they saw. Anne Marie's family gatherings had produced children, many children. At first, they seemed like a blessing, proof that the Colton line still carried strength. But as the years passed, the blessing began to curdle into something uncanny. Visitors who came to the plantation noticed it immediately. A strange sameness in the children's faces, as if carved from one fragile pattern. They shared the same narrow jaw, the same pale complexion, the same dark, sunken eyes. Even their voices carried a similar timbre, a faint echo of each other, that unsettled guests who stayed long enough to hear them speak. The community began to turn away. Invitations to social gatherings stopped. Preachers no longer visited. Field hands whispered that the children followed one another like shadows, never straying far from their mother's watchful gaze. Rumors spread of Anne Marie's iron control, her insistence that the children never mix with outsiders, that they never leave the grounds alone, that every decision about their lives passed through her first. But the most disturbing detail came not from whispers. It came from observation. Neighbors described how Anne Marie seemed to select who could and could not enter her circle, always from her own bloodline. A nephew, a cousin, a niece, summoned quietly, drawn into her parlor, and then seldom seen again without a child in her arms, months later. These pairings were not spoken of in public, but the evidence lived in the children's identical features, in the way the family tree folded back onto itself. By the middle of decade, the Colton plantation was no longer spoken of as a proud southern estate. It was called something darker, a place where the widow ruled as both matriarch and architect of a design no god had blessed, where a bloodline was not nurtured by chance or love, but by force, manipulation, and secrecy. And yet, no one dared intervene. Because by then, the children were too many. The bloodline had already been reshaped into something that could not be undone. By 1857, the Colton plantation had become a place people avoided. The dirt road that once carried wagons of visitors now grew wild with weeds, and travelers on horseback quickened their pace when passing its gates. To the outside world, Anne Marie presented herself as a grieving widow still guarding her land. But those who lived nearby whispered that she was something else entirely, an architect of her own blood, tightening the noose of kinship until nothing new could enter. Neighbors spoke of strange processions at dusk, lanterns moving between the fields, children walking in pairs, barefoot, as if performing some private ritual under her command. When asked about schooling, Anne Marie claimed to teach them herself, insisting that outsiders have no place in shaping the Colton mind. The older children never attended church. Instead, they sat beside their mother in the parlor each Sunday, where she read aloud passages not from the Bible, but from family journals. Words about duty, purity, and the sacredness of blood. Servants who tried to leave carried stories into town. One described how mirrors were covered throughout the house, not out of mourning, but because the children did not like to see themselves. Another swore the older boys and girls were forbidden from courting anyone outside the family, as though love itself was a betrayal of their mother's design. By this time, the resemblance among them had grown more disturbing. Their faces were not just similar. They were unnervingly uniform. One visitor, a cousin from Savannah, wrote in a letter that sitting among the Colton children felt like being surrounded by reflections of the same figure, each with only the slightest shift of expression, as though molded by one sculptor's hand. The town preacher warned parishioners quietly that the Colton house breeds what is unnatural. But still, no one stepped in. Ear kept them silent. For in the South of the 1850s, land meant power, and Anne-Marie still controlled both. She was not a madwoman in rags, but a sharp, intelligent widow who knew exactly how to keep the law at bay. And so the plantation became an island of secrecy, a fortress of blood. Outside, the world marched toward war. Inside, the Colton name grew tighter, darker, and more fragile with every birth. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, much of Georgia was thrown into turmoil. Plantations burned, families fled, and the old Southern order cracked under cannon fire. But on the Colton land, there was no open defiance, no young men sent to the front lines. The Colton boys, Anne-Marie's sons and grandsons, were kept home. Neighbors noted with unease that she refused to let them fight, insisting they were too vital to risk in battle. Some said this was cowardice. Others whispered the truth. Anne-Marie knew her family could not survive beyond its walls. If her carefully woven bloodline were broken, everything she had built would unravel. And so, as war raged just miles away, the Colton plantation grew more withdrawn, shuddered in eerie silence, while the rest of Georgia bled. By this time, the signs of decay were unmistakable. The children of her early unions had grown into young adults. Their faces bore the repetition of one another, but their bodies carried the burden of her choices. Bent spines, trembling hands, and eyes that failed before their time. One daughter was said to lose her mind completely, wandering the halls, speaking only in whispers, as if haunted by voices no one else could hear. Another son lived past 20, but could not speak, communicating only in guttural sounds that frightened the servants. Still, Anne-Marie pressed forward. New children were born, even as old ones faltered. Her obsession had transformed into a ritual, an unbreakable commandment, carved into her descendants. For her, it was never about the happiness of her children. It was about legacy, about ensuring that the Colton name would never be diluted, never surrendered to outsiders, never erased by war or time. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? By the end of the war in 1865, much of the South lay in ruin. Yet the Colton house still stood. Its shutters were closed, its family rarely seen. And yet, when glimpses were caught, what people saw filled them with unease. A brood of young faces so eerily familiar, it was impossible to tell one from the next. A lineage that had survived the war, not by courage, but by retreating deeper into its own shadows. The war ended, but for the Colton family, the silence continued. For years, the plantation gates remained closed, the fields untended, the house looming like a mausoleum. But by the late 1860s, travelers and freedmen searching for work began drifting through the area. It was then that outsiders finally stepped foot on Colton soil, and what they saw would ripple into whispered legend. A Union veteran wrote in his journal that he had stopped at the plantation seeking water. He described the house as dark as if no living thing resided within. Yet when he knocked, children appeared at the windows. He noted that their faces struck him with a chill. They were like mirrors, all the same. Each boy another copy, each girl another twin. The man left quickly, writing that it felt as though the house watched him through their eyes. Another account came from a teacher sent to establish schools for freed children in rural Georgia. Passing by the Colton plantation, she claimed she saw several pale figures standing in the cotton fields, barefoot and unmoving, as if waiting for her to speak. When she called out, none of them answered. Instead, they turned in unison and walked slowly back toward the house without a word. By now, Anne-Marie herself was aging, but her presence lingered as strong as ever. Visitors claimed she never appeared frail or diminished. Instead, she sat upright in her parlor chair, veiled in black, commanding her children and grandchildren as if they were soldiers obeying orders. One guest described her voice as soft but absolute, like the creak of a locked door you could never force open. The servants who remained told darker stories, of children who cried without reason at night, of siblings who refused to eat unless seated in perfect order, of cousins who did not recognize where one family member ended and another began. By then, the Coltons were less a family than a single, twisted organism bound together by the widow's will. And yet, Anne-Marie herself never spoke of shame. To her, this was triumph. Her family had endured the war, endured disease, endured whispers of madness. She had done what no other plantation matriarch dared. She had forced her bloodline into permanence, no matter the cost. Anne-Marie Colton did not live forever, though for many it seemed she might. In the spring of 1872, the widow finally died in her sleep, sitting upright in the same parlor chair where she had ruled her family for decades. When her body was found, her face was peaceful, her hands folded neatly, as though she had been waiting for death rather than fearing it. But her death did not free the Coltons. It chained them more tightly than ever. Without her command, the children and grandchildren were left to themselves. Yet none of them could function beyond the boundaries she had set. They married only each other. They raised children who looked like echoes of their parents. By the late 19th century, the Colton name was still present on county records, but neighbors no longer visited the house. The family had become a shadow, tucked away inside their crumbling plantation, too strange to approach and too frightening to confront. What disturbed outsiders most was not just the appearance of the Coltons, but the silence surrounding them. They did not speak freely in town. They rarely bought or sold goods. When one of them appeared in public, it was usually in pairs or groups, faces blank, eyes lowered, voices almost whispered. It was as if they carried a private language, a code inherited from their matriarch, one meant to keep the outside world forever locked away. In time, the Colton house fell into ruin. Vines crawled up its walls, windows shattered in storms. By the early 20th century, the plantation was abandoned altogether. Yet travelers who wandered too close swore they saw figures moving in the fields at dusk, pale shapes with the same mirrored faces, walking slowly as if still bound by the widow's will. The records do not say how long the family line continued. Some believe it ended quietly, consumed by its own weakness. Others insist descendants still live nearby, hid, den among us, carrying fragments of that same blood, the same faces repeating across generations. History does not mark Anne Marie Colton as a monster. It barely marks her at all. But her legacy survives in whispers, in the shadows of a ruined house, and in the chilling reminder that sometimes the most disturbing horrors are not ghosts or curses. Sometimes they are choices. Choices that refuse to die, even after the one who made them has long turned to dust.